Hello? All right. Okay, so my name is Maya. I am the engineering manager for the VMware BOSH contributors for the most part, and there's one other engineering manager there with me. Full disclaimer, I have not contributed code to the BOSH code base in about 2 years now, but I can tell you all about its features. So I originally proposed this talk as a lightning talk, but I was given a full half hour. So we're going to zoom out and talk about the Foundational Infrastructure Working Group and some of the other components in there. Then we'll kind of talk about what's new in those components and a little bit of the roadmap. And then we'll actually do what I said I'd talk about, which is do a deep dive on the NATS rotation. Okay, so the Foundational Infrastructure Working Group is a lot of components. I'm not going to talk about all of them. There's another talk about metrics and logging, and another talk about Jammy, which is going to kind of touch on most of the stem cell part of this. And I have nothing on backups or restore, Postgres. So if you have questions on those, you're going to have to ask the open source community. So the working group, we have 2 leads, Behan and Ruben. They hold a weekly recorded call. If you want details, there's that tiny URL at the bottom where you can find the link to the Zoom meeting. And then we have 36 approvers over 120 Git repos. Not all approvers approve PRs for all Git repos, but I think it's worth calling out that kind of some of our 2 more prolific repos have about 50 PRs apiece. Each of those PRs has 2 approvers review them, say it looks good to me, and then it gets merged in and then has to go through CI. So there's been quite a lot of activity here to get all these code changes through. All right, MySQL. So I pulled the MySQL team and asked them, what would you like me to say? And this is what they gave me. They added MySQL 8 support to this PXC release. I'm actually not sure what CF deployment is using right now, but getting CF deployment on MySQL 8 is a future planned change. When we rolled out the Jammy stem cell in May, pretty much all BOSH releases had to make a few tweaks in order to make their code compatible, MySQL included, and they've added TLS Everywhere support. UAA and CredHub. I think it's kind of exciting to point out that as of this year, VMware is no longer using proprietary forks. They're now using the open source versions of both of these code bases. CredHub added MySQL 8 compatibility. They're both Jammy compatible. And then CredHub did some improvement to performance, and UAA had some security improvements. I think UAA and CredHub were both also hit by the Log4j changes last December, and I think this team worked quite hard to get new releases that were patched out. I think there was like 2 or 3 rounds of new CV, new CV, new CV, right around Christmas. And in the future, I don't know what these are, but OIDC and PKCE support are potentially planned. Okay, the BOSH side. So one of the big changes this year was getting a Cloud Foundry Foundation-owned CI instance that would hold a lot of these core components. So Bionic and Jammy are both on this concourse instance, and now kind of this big pool of approvers can now cut these releases whenever it makes sense to. And on this right, you can see this graphic. I'm sorry, number 3 approver, I think my screenshot cut you off. But these are all the contributors to that Git repo, and I think Ramon is winning with 47 commits to this code base in the last year. We improved the NATS cert rotation feature. We're going to talk about that later. We also did some template rendering speedups. So when you BOSH deploy, one of the first steps we do is we try to render templates that will kind of save your job properties and send them to the BOSH deployed VM. What we found was that we weren't caching some of the calls to CredHub, for instance. So if you had a ton of certificates or secrets, we'd grab them over and over and over again. And by caching that, especially bigger or more complex deployments saw significant speed improvements. There's a new Jammy stem cell. I think I've said that already. And then, let's see, SAP, I think, largely championed this native IS disk resize. So BOSH, when you do a disk resize, not using this feature, will tell the IS to give me a new disk of the larger size, and then it'll copy bits over manually. So that it can be kind of slow. So this feature, I don't know what CPIs it's in, I think AWS at the very least, will leverage IS native methods to do the disk resize, which should be a speed improvement. There's a FIP stem cell. In order to use this, I think because it's like a canonical proprietary thing, you might need to get a token from them. But as long as you have this token, you can build a FIPS compatible stem cell. Oh, and then we have IMDS V2 support. So IMDS is the protocol from which a BOSH deployed VM will talk to the metadata service. It's just a GET call for IMDS V1. And AWS is the first IaaS to support IMDS V2, and I think it does like a put call, and so there's a little bit more authentication built into this call. Other notable changes, I mean, these are a little bit less glamorous, but we bumped to Ruby 3, which is great because Ruby 2.7 goes out of support sometime soon, so it's good to stay CV compliant or patchable. We removed the global package cache. This was like a precursor to things that existed before compiled releases really took off. We addressed some issues that the open source community opened up against some Postgres issues. We bumped to NATS 2.0, which is a pretty big change because this moved us off a open source fork where we added in some authentication to kind of secure this endpoint, and now NATS 2.0 has this functionality built into it. We also added more modern VM types to BOSH deployment, and I think David Stevenson has a talk about kind of the counterpart to this on the CF side, but this was kind of part of the same movement to kind of modernize VM types across all our offerings. And then I have the BOSH director contributors on the left here. All right, so what do we have planned? I guess I didn't call this disclaimer on the other slides, but things might drop off. Kind of echoing what Greg said, this is tentatively future thinking, but things might change. Okay, so for recovery, right now, if you have a deployment and an AZ goes down, the option is like, oh yeah, I'll just deploy with a new manifest that kind of just removes this AZ, and then we'll get there eventually. That's great, but it's still going to use canaries and max in flight, and it might be a bit slower than what you want. Like when an AZ goes down, maybe you just want to be like, I want to spin up 50 new VMs all at once, and hopefully my eyes can handle it. And we don't support that right now. That's something we're thinking about. We are still getting some bug reports on Jammy, and we're looking at addressing those. There is a RHEL 8.5 stem cell in flight. I think there's an open PR that still has some discussion on it, which is, we ripped out support for CentOS, I think a year or two ago. So this will be like, I guess, back to our second distribution of stem cells. That's not Linux. I'd also like to deprecate the BOSH V1 cloud provider interface in the next year. I think all of the cloud provider interfaces in kind of active support the V2 CPI, which came out, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago now. So if we can deprecate this fully, we can rip out more cruft in the BOSH code base. All right, now we get to talk about the NATS cert rotation. All right, so zooming back, what is NATS? Actually, I'll step back a little further. There's 3.5 ways that a BOSH director can kind of send information to a BOSH deployed VM. The first is via the metadata service. That's kind of like the metadata server, which is provided by the IaaS. The second, well, I guess the halfway, is that we can communicate with the IaaS directly and tell it like, oh, this is your IP for the VM, this is the disk we want to attach, etc. we can send information via the blob store. So the director can write to the blob store, and then the BOSH deployed VM can eventually read from the blob store. And then we can use NATS. So if you type into the command line BOSH VMs, whether or not you had the vitals command really, it will send it to the director. The director will send a get state call out to all of the VMs, and the VMs will send back a response. So I guess what I'm saying is NATS is a messaging service, which is the primary method by which the director can communicate directly with all BOSH deployed VMs. All right, so now we're talking about how they actually communicate. So this NAT connection is a TLS-based connection. So we have to get, I think this is actually a basic auth example. But we have to get the cert and the CA over to this BOSH deployed VM. And I guess I talked about the 3.5 methods. We don't have a method of kind of communicating to this agent directly because our method is NATS, and without the cert and CA, we can't just like open this connection. So we write to the metadata service, and we send up our NATS credentials to it. And then when the VM bootstraps, it can just do a get call to this metadata server and copy all this data into the settings.json, and then establish this connection. And it just subscribes to the director channel, and it will send heartbeats. And the director, when it doesn't notice these heartbeats, might resurrect the VM. It might send a BOSH stop or a BOSH start down this connection. There we go. Okay. Now, the other thing we talked about is what happens when you want to rotate this. So BOSH really optimizes for the least amount of downtime possible. And if you're rotating the credentials that communicate between the BOSH director and the BOSH deployed VMs, you don't necessarily want to just stop that connection while you're doing this rotation. So we do this as a 3-step rollout, ideally. I mean, you don't really have to, but in the BOSH docs, we describe this as kind of the ideal way to do it. So when you start out, you have your old CA and your old certs deployed. So step 1 will be you'll add a second CA to your BOSH director. You'll generate new certs off that, and then redeploy every single VM so it has both sets of certs on it. Then you'll redeploy the director again to rip off the first CA, and hopefully at that point you've redeployed all your other VMs, because otherwise they'll stop working at that point. Well, I'm sorry, they'll continue to work, but the BOSH director will no longer be able to communicate with them. And then as the last step, you'll recreate all the VMs one more time to remove the old certs on those. And I guess it's worth calling out, this metadata service that's provided by the IaaS, for some IaaSes, it's immutable. So we can only write to it at VM startup. So that means that for these 2 arrow steps, it's a recreate of VMs. It's not just a deploy. We actually have to tear the VM down and give you new ones. And that's pretty painful. Oh, the other bit is that BOSH does not track the state of recreates the way we do with redeploys. So during a normal deploy, you can go halfway down and say, like, a VM fails. We'll stop right there. And if when you hit deploy again, we'll kind of continue from that point onward. With the recreate flag, we don't keep track of that state. So every time you run a deploy -- recreate, it recreates everything. So your option when this fails is to either track what you haven't recreated and what you have, and then kind of like manually run commands to kind of deploy one by one by one, or you have to just take this penalty in time over and over again. And then the other part is it's pretty easy to lose people after step 3 because things kind of work at that point, and they might not do step 4 and 5 of this diagram to kind of clean up the old CAs and certs. So we sent a PM to go talk to people that were using this, and kind of the problem that he narrowed down on, actually I should shout his name, John Mooney was our product manager, pointed out that the recreates were kind of the heart of this problem. And if we could remove them, we'd hopefully keep more people along on kind of this full process. Okay, so this is our new state. So you'll do step 1, you'll add a new CA, and then you'll just run a normal BOSH deploy, so no BOSH deploy -- recreate. when you do the add new CA, it will change this NATS config SHA-1 in the database. And then I'll come back to that in a second. But during the deploy, the first command we run is a BOSH stop, so we kind of stop the running jobs on this BOSH VM. Then the director will pick up this SHA change, and it will, in kind of the subsequent commands, send an update settings call to the BOSH VM and pass in this new NATS certificate and CA. And the VM will write this to an update settings file. And the update settings is preferred over the settings.json. So like if this is a new VM, it might not have much in update settings, but it will have stuff in settings.json, which it'll use to start the connection. But this is hopefully like a pre-existing VM that we're using and trying to rotate the certs on. So then the big change here is that these two arrows are now redeploys and not recreates. So you know, users can bundle this into like a stem cell update, or if you're just doing a monthly CVE bump of all your code, you could just bundle this deploy into that. And the goal is hopefully less folks are running into situations where their NAT certs expire and then all of a sudden the director can't talk to anything. But if they do expire, because that connection mechanism is gone, the recreate flow is kind of what you'll have to default to. The other nice thing is that this change is relatively backwards compatible. You can use a new stem cell and an old director, and it will just do the old flow of recreates for this process. Okay, I guess that was it for my talk. If you have questions on any of the components that I don't have context on, probably the open source Slack is on the Cloud Foundry Slack are the best source. All right, thank you.
Questions that people have? Going once, going twice? Yes, at the back.
Maya, I didn't quite understand the relationship of the BOSH stop to the certificate rotation. Like, is it requiring the stop to propagate the new settings? I always thought those were just picked up immediately.
I think the update settings is sent between the BOSH stop and the BOSH start.
What triggers the stop? What triggers the stop?
During a BOSH deploy.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's still rolling the certificate during a deploy. It's not like out of band, just rotating it without a deploy.
No, we don't have a way to rotate it without a deploy. Oh. And I think it also restarts the agent to reset the NATS connection with the new
right, yeah,
cert.
That makes sense. Okay, thank you.
You had mentioned that RHEL 8.5 stem cells are on the roadmap. Do you know if there are any Red Hat licensing implications, since RHEL is a subscription-based product from Red Hat?
I don't know.
Okay. I can ask a Slack channel.
Anyone online with a question, Chris?
All right. If you have any more questions, I'm at Maya on the Cloud Foundry BOSH Slack channel. Thanks.